The loss of color. One morning, the pig family woke up, and everything in the house seemed strange. Peppa and George noticed that their toys on the shelf looked a little dull, and the bright pictures on the walls had become faded. At first, it didn't seem like anything unusual, and the parents didn't pay much attention to it. But by evening, the situation worsened. Mama Pig put a cup on the kitchen table and noticed that it had turned a strange gray color. Daddy Pig put down a newspaper, and it too started losing its bright color, turning into a dull shade. Everything they touched gradually lost its color, as if their world was becoming more and more muted. The next day, when Peppa and George woke up, the whole house was nearly devoid of color. The carpets on the floor, the furniture, even the fruits in the kitchen, everything had turned gray. In the evening, when Peppa looked out the window, she noticed that the trees and the sky had also lost their vibrant hues and became cold and colorless. Even the sun, which usually brought warmth, now seemed dim, as if its light couldn't break through the darkness. Peppa began to worry that something very bad was happening, but Mama and Daddy Pig reassured her that everything would be fine. However, with each passing day, the color in the house disappeared more rapidly. Peppa tried to bring something back into her room, but her toys became increasingly dull, and the books and other things seemed to be fading right before her eyes. One night, Peppa woke up and noticed that the house had become completely dark, even though the lamps were on. She went down the hallway and discovered that even the light in the lamps had become faint and cold. When she reached the kitchen, she saw that even the fire in the fireplace had gone out, and instead of warmth, it gave off only cold. Peppa realized that the disappearance of color wasn't just a strange occurrence. It was something much more terrifying. She went to find her parents, but they looked just as dull as everything else around them. Daddy Pig was sitting at the table, but his face was gray, and he didn't even notice when Peppa approached. As soon as she touched him, everything around them began to disappear again. There was no more sound or light in the house. Peppa felt her own body becoming more and more pale and transparent, as if she too was losing her form. In the final moment, when the entire house was consumed by the gray color, Peppa heard the warm voice of Granny Pig, who explained that this was the result of forgotten joys and clouded memories. When happiness fades from the world, when things no longer bring joy, color begins to disappear. And in the end, everything, even the ones closest to you, becomes consumed by shadow. Peppa tried to find a way out, but everything around her became even more dull, and eventually she disappeared, leaving an empty, colorless space. Everything that had once been bright and alive was swallowed by the darkness. Behind the closed-door night had fallen in Peppa Pig's house. After dinner, she and George went upstairs to their room, changed into their pajamas, and climbed into bed. The evening was just like any other. Mummy Pig came in to say goodnight, turned off the light, and left the door slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of warm light from the hallway to spill into the room. The familiar silence settled in, broken only by George's steady breathing as he quickly drifted off to sleep, curled up under his blanket. A few hours passed. Outside, the sky was completely dark, and pale moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting faint shadows on the walls. Then Peppa woke up. She didn't know what had stirred her from sleep, but a strange uneasiness settled deep inside her the moment she opened her eyes. The room looked the same as always, stuffed animals in the corner, books neatly arranged on the shelves, the nightlight sitting on the bedside table. But something felt wrong. A chill crept down her spine as she realized what it was: the door. When she had gone to bed, the door had been slightly open, letting the soft glow from the hallway seep in. Now it was shut tight. Peppa slowly sat up in bed, her breath shallow. The door had never closed on its own before. Someone must have pushed it shut. But she hadn't heard any footsteps, no creak of the floorboards, no movement at all. Her gaze flickered toward George, still fast asleep, unaware of the growing fear inside her. She hesitated, then carefully slid out of bed, placing her feet on the cool floor. The air in the room felt heavier than usual, pressing against her like an invisible weight. Step by step, she crept toward the door, barely daring to breathe. She reached for the doorknob, turned it gently, pulled. Nothing. The door wouldn't open. Her hands trembled as she tightened her grip, pulling harder this time. The knob didn't even budge, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. A deep, sickening dread filled her chest. She swallowed hard and pressed her ear against the wood. The hallway should have been quiet. There should have been nothing there. But there was something. She couldn't hear it move, couldn't hear it breathe, but she could feel it. The presence was unmistakable, heavy, cold, and waiting. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then the sound came, a soft, deliberate knock. Once, twice, 3 times. Each knock was slow, calculated, as if whatever was on the other side was waiting for her to respond. Peppa stumbled back, her pulse hammering in her ears. The fear was unbearable now, wrapping around her like icy chains. And then it spoke. The voice was hers, exactly hers. Calm, familiar, slightly sleepy, like an echo of herself. But something was wrong. It was too smooth, too measured, too empty. She didn't know how long she stood there, frozen. At some point, she swore she saw the doorknob twitch. Just slightly, just enough to let her know it was still there. Without thinking, she turned and rushed back to bed, pulling the covers over her head and squeezing her eyes shut. She knew that if it wanted to, it could come in, but it didn't. The night stretched on, silent and endless, and in the morning the door was slightly open again, as if nothing had ever happened. Endless night. Peppa woke up in the middle of the night. She immediately felt that something was wrong. Usually, even at night, her room wasn't completely dark. Streetlights outside, the soft glow of the moon, the faint light from her night lamp. But now she was surrounded by absolute darkness. She blinked, trying to adjust to it, but nothing changed. The darkness was thick, like heavy smoke, like a black veil that had covered the entire house. Peppa slowly sat up in bed. A strange unease tightened in her chest. She reached out, found her night lamp, and flicked the switch. The light did not turn on. Peppa frowned. She swung her legs off the bed. The floor was cold, colder than usual. She walked to the window and cautiously pulled back the curtains. Her breath caught in her throat. Outside was endless, bottomless darkness. No moon, no stars, no distant glows from the neighbors' houses. Only black emptiness. Peppa pressed her face against the glass, straining her eyes to see anything, but the longer she looked, the more it seemed like the dark mass outside was moving, like it was alive. A chill crawled up her spine. She turned and ran out of her room. The house was silent, too silent. She called for Mummy Pig, for Daddy Pig, for George. No answer. The door to her parents' bedroom was slightly open. Peppa froze in the hallway. She didn't want to go inside, but she had to. Taking a shaky breath, she pushed the door open. The beds were empty. The blankets were neatly tucked in, as if they had never been used. Peppa took a step back. This was not her house. It couldn't be. She ran downstairs to the front door. She grabbed the handle and pulled. Locked. She rushed to the living room window and pressed her face to the glass. The town was motionless. The streets were swallowed in thick blackness. The houses stood as silent shadows. Usually there would be lights in the windows, but now not a single house was glowing. Not a single sound. No footsteps, no distant hum of cars, no rustling wind. Only silence. Peppa stepped outside. The cold air pricked her skin. She walked down the road, glancing around. No one. She reached the town square where her friends usually played, but where the town should have been, there was now a vast, endless void. The ground abruptly ended. like the town had been erased, leaving only this black abyss behind. Peppa stepped back, her heart pounding. And then, in the silence, a sound echoed, a slow, heavy footstep. Peppa turned around. A figure stood in the middle of the empty street, tall, motionless, faceless, blending into the darkness. The figure did not move, but Peppa felt its gaze on her. She took a step back. The figure came closer. It didn't walk, it just was suddenly nearer. A deep fear settled in her chest. She turned and ran. But with every step, the road beneath her feet disappeared. The houses melted into the void. The town was vanishing, as if it had never existed. Peppa screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. She fell to her knees, looking around frantically. Nothing. Only emptiness. And then, breathing. Software. Cold. Right behind her. A whisper. Someone said her name. She spun around. The darkness collapsed. And then, nothing. The next morning, the town was gone. Not a single soul remained. Only endless night, and someone standing at its center. Someone who remembered how things used to be. But now, everything belonged to the darkness. The wrong voices. The morning started as usual. Peppa woke up, stretched, and listened to the familiar sounds of the house. The smell of breakfast drifted from the kitchen. George was already playing with his dinosaur, and birds were singing outside the window. Everything felt peaceful and normal. She went downstairs, took her seat at the table, picked up her spoon, and was just about to start eating when she heard Mummy Pig calling her name. The voice came from upstairs, from the hallway leading to the bedrooms. That was strange. Mummy Pig was standing right in front of her, making breakfast. Peppa froze, gripping her spoon tightly. She looked at her mother, but she didn't seem to notice anything unusual. Daddy Pig, calmly reading his newspaper, didn't react either. The voice called again. It was exactly like her mother's, warm, gentle, familiar. But why was it coming from somewhere it shouldn't be? Slowly, she put her spoon down, glanced at her parents one more time, and hesitantly walked toward the stairs. As she climbed up, the house felt quieter than usual. The hallway looked the same as always, but something felt off. She took another step forward, and the voice called again. This time, it was coming from behind the door of her own bedroom. Peppa swallowed hard. A chilling thought crept into her mind. If Mummy Pig was here, downstairs, then who was calling her from inside her room? She hesitated, then placed her hand on the doorknob. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. The voice had stopped, but now she could hear something else. Breathing, slow, heavy, not hers. The doorknob twitched slightly under her fingers, as if someone inside was trying to open it. Peppa yanked her hand away and stumbled backward. At that moment, Mummy Pig's voice called her again from the kitchen, asking why she was taking so long. Peppa glanced toward the stairs, her fingers trembling. When she turned back to her door, a shadow slipped out from underneath it. She didn't wait to see what it was. She turned and ran. At breakfast, no one called for her again. Mummy, Daddy, and George ate, talked, and laughed as usual. Peppa sat silently, trying to convince herself that it had all been in her imagination. But the next day, when she heard her name again, the voice was coming from inside her closet.